Hello everyone, welcome to the new series of the channel Solving League, and today we'll dive into the Hwei Q abilities. And before we go into the video, I just want to inform you that if you have an interesting topic you would want me to cover, just comment it down below, I'll consider it. And for now, just enjoy the video. Right, so quickly about the video content. So we'll start with the quick results representations, and then we'll do a deep dive into the theory behind it. Starting from the Q overview, then I'll introduce the Excel sheet I've made and how to use it, as well as we'll look into the 3D graphs. And we'll follow it with the results walkthrough and explanation, as well as how to look at the graphs and analyze them. And just before we start the video, all the material and files are made available for you if you just press the link to the Google Drive in the description below, and you can download it or view it in the drive. And now let's just jump to the results. Right, so both graphs you'll see a representation of the AP range from 0 to 1000, and both graphs represents rank 5Q ability. You can also see that graphs represents the percentage HP and max HP values, and goes from, for max HP, from 0 to basically infinity, and from percentage HP from 100% to 0. So on this graph, you can see the QE minimum, and what it actually means is basically the minimum damage you can take from the QE ability. In the next graph, it will be QE average, and it's basically the damage you typically would take if you stand the whole duration in the QE ability. Directly on the graph, you can see these different colored regions. And basically what those regions represents are the abilities that in that region would deal the maximum damage. And dark blue represents the QE minimum, dark red represents the QQ, and gray represents QW. The lighter blue represents the region where both QE minimum and QW can have a range of AP where they deal the most damage. The purple region will represent where QE minimum and QQ will have the overlap, and the light red will represent the overlap from QQ and QW. The region in the middle of all of those colors is the region of all three abilities. So basically in that region we'll have an overlap of all three abilities. And for the multi-ability regions, so QE minimum will favor high P values over QW and QQ. QQ will favor higher P values over QW in the range of 100% to 20%, and vice versa, QW will favor higher P values from over 20% to 0% range. And what it means, so for example, if we look the region under the QE, we have a light region from 50 to 30% percent HP. And if we go, like, for example, to 40% HP, we can assume that if you have like 700 AP, you should choose using QE because it will deal more damage because it favors high AP. However, if you have like 250, 300, you should already choose QW. Alright, moving to the next graph, we can see that it is a little bit different. However, we should understand that we need to read it the same way as the previous one. The only more complex part is that the triple region is a little bit bigger, meaning that you need to understand more and you can't easily predict which ability in that region will deal more damage. And another interesting thing to note is that typically Of course, there are some different things like the QQ being instant and QE being slow. How, if you're looking purely from math perspective, the QQ has very limited range where it deals more damage than other abilities. In the sense that most games you don't encounter champions with 5000 plus HPs. And this basically concludes our section of the brief results overview. And now we'll move to the ability queue overview. All the screenshots of the abilities descriptions you'll see in this section are taken from the League of Legends wiki or League fandom. Starting with QQ, it is a rather simple spell. It does damage instantly on the landing. The base damage goes from 60 to 180, has 75% AP scaling, and the maximum health damage goes from 3 to 7%. In the graph, you can see the rank 1 QQ damage with scaling with AP. It also has the shift in the magic damage based on the enemy maximum health. And that's basically what you need to understand from this graph. Alright, now moving to the QW. It is also an instant damage spell. It has a base damage from 80 to 160 with 25% scaling. However, it deals additional damage if the target is isolated or immobilized based on the missing percentage HP. And because it scales with the missing HP, it has a varying AP scaling based on your current HP. And that is what you can see on the graph. So the shift is because of the multiplier, which increases once you are losing percentage HP, as well as the decreasing angle with the decreasing HP percentage values, because the AP scaling is increasing with decreasing percentage HP value. Moving to QE, it is a little bit more interesting and a bit more nuanced ability. So basically, it has area damage, which is like from 20 to 100 plus 30% AP, and it is kind of instant once you walk onto the blazing path. However, you also get set on fire and start ticking for 2.5 seconds every 0.25 seconds by 5 to 25 plus 5% AP damage. And this indicates that the minimum amount of damage you can take is one a blazing path explosion, so the one area damage, and then 10 ticks. However, if your opponent will stand longer in your blazing path, he will receive another area damage, but instead of taking another 20 to 100 plus 30% ability power damage, it will reset the burning. So what it means? It means that the target will take more ticking damage. And basically, if you stand the full duration, you should get 12 ticks instead of 10 ticks. However, and I'm not sure why it's happening, there are some places on the ability where you can take from minimum damage, which is like 10 ticks, to 13 ticks, meaning you get an additional tick. The only positions I noticed was for the minimum damage, once you stand in the full duration of the QE, and it is at the beginning and at the end of the ability. And now if you remember when I was talking about using different notations for the QE damage, this is basically where it comes from. And you can see 3 of them on the graph. I only put the QE minimum, QE average, and QE max. But the analysis will be done with the QE minimum and QE average. Now, what's so important from this graph is that the additional ticks not only shifts a damage to the right, but also increases the ability power scaling. What we can do now is group all abilities together and look at their AP scaling, and it will help us to analyze the results afterwards. So QQ has 75%, QW has a scaling from 25 to 87.5%, QE minimum has 80%, and QE average has 90%. An important thing to note right now is that QQ will be caught at 20% HP by QW. And this will become more important later, but for now just note it. Oops, almost forgot. Do you remember when I was talking about the QE ticks and how they work? Well, apparently there is also the similar case with the ultimate, where you can do an additional tick of damage. And with this, we'll end the overview of the Q ability and we'll jump to the Excel sheet. Okay, so the Excel sheet consists of 5 sheets. The first is basically the calculator. There are a bunch of inputs. As you can see, the input cells are gray and the output cells are dark blue. You can change the level, which impacts the passive. You can change AP, you can change max HP, you can change the current HP. That impacts the QW. You can add armor, magic pen, stuff like that. You can change the skill levels of the abilities. And you can also add up damage to find the post-mitigated damage based on the input magic resist and magic pen, if you want to do that for some reason. And it's basically, yeah, basic calculations using the formulas I'm using everywhere. Another data sheet is basically for, basically just for charts on the last sheet. I wouldn't recommend changing much. However, if you know how it's working and stuff like that, you can change it. Just because I forgot, there you can also change yes to any other input to change the QW from being the immobilized or single target conditions to the base conditions. Okay. And moving to level 5. So level 5 is more interesting because I used it for analysis. Here are couple different cases. You can, if you go to the graph, you press the filter emblem, you can see that it has different scenarios added. So for example, you can put the, you can look at what's the difference between Q values. For example, here will be output like 1000, 2000, 3000, 4000 max HP values for Qs. You can, for example, leave 4000 right and add Q minimum and see how these two curves interact. And you can see that Q minimum, QE minimum is lower throughout all AP values. You can then combine it, for example, okay, but what if we add like 20% QW? Oh, we can see that QW does more damage and stuff like that. So these are fixed values. If you want to play with them, sure. However, in the next window, where is the Q damage? This is basically the inputs. And here you can input the maximum HP for the Q value. You can change the skill level, which impacts all of them. You can change the HP percentage, which impacts the QW. And also, if you want, you can switch the AP scaling range. However, you make sure you use switch to the last row, because all of the other values are basically linked to the AP values one by one. Okay. Once again, you can use the filter sign. You can add whatever you want. You can add, for example, compare Q average with Q minimum or Q maximum. And you just press apply. You get 3 different graphs. Okay. Hey, and this is probably like if you want to visualize interconnected regions on the graphs, this is probably the best place to have it. You can just input exact values. You see at what AP points they interact, and so yeah. For example, let's say we want to see the QQ right with QW, right, and we can see that at, for example, 4750 and 15% HP, you can get the interconnection region where you can get the AP values. You can look here for more exact AP, so and find the interaction point where one value becomes higher than the other. The last window is basically the ability screenshots with all the scalings and stuff like that. This is for passive and EW, E, and E as well as ultimate. This is basically level 1, so if you understand how to switch level 1 data, you can manipulate these as well. And this, I also put the graphs from the Q level 5 data and Q damage comparison chart here as well. And that's basically it about the Excel and how to use it. And now let's jump to the 3D graphs. Right, so right before we go to the 3D graphs, I thought I'll show you how the Google Drive should look like. So there should be like 5 documents. The Word file or the text file, the 2 PDF files, which are basically the diagrams of the results, the Excel file, and another text file where you can find the links to the 3D graphs. And so the first graph is basically a comparison of the QQ and QE. So here you can see that's like level 5 QQ, 180 plus 75% ability power, scaling plus 10% max HP scaling. And the QE, this is right now the average, is taken A. If you want to change it to the minimum, you just switch A to B or just input 10 instead of A. And here's another choice. There's a input, there's a cross line, which you can see. It basically represents the boundary when both of the planes are equal to each other. Okay. So if you look at the shapes of it, we can see that the QE has no difference in Z direction, which is basically HP values. Okay, X here is AP values from 0 to 1000, and Y is damage values from 0 to 1.5 thousand, I think. And Z is HP values from 0 to 7.5 thousand, because putting higher values doesn't make a lot of difference, because at 7,000 the QQ anyways outscales everyone. So what we can use 3D graphs for is basically we put both graphs in and we look through the Z and X direction. What it shows, basically the colors, what we are seeing are dealing less damage, okay? Because basically they have lower Y values. So here we can see that until the 2000, around 2500, the QQ deals less damage, and around 5000 here, it's 3000. My bad. And here it's around 5000. It starts dealing more damage. Okay, that's just sample use of these graphs. This is the graph comparing QE and QW. Once again, the blue color is QE, while the purple or color is the QW. And if we look at the QW, we can see that it has varying size, varying aspects in the Z direction, and in this graph, Z direction is basically the percentages of the current HP. So 1 represents 100, 0.8 represents 80, and so on. And if we look again through the Z and X direction, we can see that at around 40%, at 0 LP, QW starts dealing the same damage as QE. Okay, but because QE favors high scaling, we can see this is decreasing over time, and only at the end, which is around 15% or something like that, which we had the it's easier to see because yeah, you can see it's around 15%. We get the area of the value where QW completely outscales the QE. Okay, so that's all about the graphs, and we'll go to the Word file next. Right, so now welcome to the foundations on the data that the graph was built on. Okay, so I will not go deeply into different values. I'll just basically introduce what I've done and what where are numbers basically taken from that you can see in the graphs that conclude all the work I've done. Okay, so once again, I'll repeat myself. The analysis was done for level 5Q ability. So if you want to analyze other skill levels of Qs, you need to do it on your own, or just go into the excellent with different values. The graphs at the end of this video and the beginning of this video are not made for it. Okay, so basically how the numbers work. I've tried to choose the numbers that are nice to the eye, so I tried to not go into the exact numbers. So for example, if the exact number was 2000, for example, 430 or 35, I would have chosen 2500 instead, because usually at the 60 AP difference or 60 HP difference, the delta value of damage at that point, at those points, is not that big. So, for example, as you can see here, at the difference between 2429 HP and 2500 HP, it's basically a 5 damage delta at 0 AP, which is like the biggest different point. Okay, so once again, we go back to the 3D graphs. This is where I use the Excel sheet with the graphs to ensure the values where QE and QQ starts like outscaling each other. Okay. This is the comparison between QE minimum and QW, and you can see how the values change based on the percentage HP dropping down. And because it is not a straight line, you cannot like directly interpolate the values in these areas, as well as because it's also because the graphs only have the percentage HP and percentage HP values. I'll get into that later a bit as well. Basically, you can't see this evaluation in the graphs, okay? But I'll talk about it later. And again, once I found out what HP values QQ basically starts outscaling QE minimum, I basically calculated every 500 HP values when QQ gets how it interacts with QW, and that's what you can see on the you will be able to see on the graph. So these are basically the numbers. This is a representation of the 2D graphs. For example, this is 40%, and I think 3000 HP. And you can see that at 40%, the QW only scratches the like at a very low AP values. Okay. And once we start decreasing HP, the percentage of HP, the QW starts scaling better and also shifts towards the higher damage. And thus, at around 30%, we could say that the QW is already dealing damage at all scenarios. Okay, so this is basically the roundups that I'm using in the graphs as well. These are from 3000 to 5.5, and then the breakdown, which is around 7,250. I used the 7.5K on the graph. Okay. Yes, and once again, another analysis. This is the QE average. The same analysis, the same type of analysis, different numbers. Okay. And that's basically the word file. The numbers I've taken from, and here again you can see all the things summed up. So the only thing you can't see in these graphs are the scaling of AP, and that's all I'll be talking on the next section. And before we jump into the last part of this video, I just want to remind you that you too can help me decide on the next topic, which could be from digging into the builds, analyzing runes, or something champions related. All you have to do is comment down below the topic you're interested. You can also come to my stream and discuss anything related to this video. Maybe you have any questions, maybe you have advices for the future topics. You can do it on my stream as well. And of course, if this content or this analysis is at all interesting for you or your friends, just share this video with them and help me by subscribing and clicking that bell. Thank you very much. Hello, welcome to the last section of the video. And in this section, I'll be representing and summing up all the information I showed you in this video, and we'll basically make up this graph, okay? So I'll repeat myself a little bit from the brief discussion of the graphs. So AP range for the graphs you see right now, and all the data is from 0 to 1000. And it's also done for the rank 5Q abilities. And if we look at the graphs, this one is the QQ and QE comparison. Once again, the QE is the blue and QQ is the red. And this is the QE against Q with QW comparison. And QE is the blue one and purple is the QW. Okay? So if you look from 0 max HP to 2.5 thousand HP, this is basically what we can see on this graph, right? Below the 2000 HP, we only see the red color, which means that the QE is dealing more damage because we don't see that color, okay? And in this region, between 2.5 and 3000 HP, which is basically the slope, it's not exact as for because I was rounding up the numbers, but it's very close to that. We can see that this is an interconnection region. An interconnection region is because we can see that which ability does more damage depends on the AP numbers, okay? But because it's linear, we can see, for example, okay, we take 2.75 thousand HP, right? And we say, right, we can assume it's around 500, the breaking point. So above 500, QE will do more damage, and below QQ. And I'll repeat once again, QQ favors lesser AP values than QE when we're comparing both of them. Why? Because QE has 80% scaling in this scenario because it's QE minimum, and QQ has 75. Okay? Right. Once we overstep 3000, which is around this point, we get into the zone where QQ is dominating. That means it has no impact, like QE has no impact there. Okay, so this is straight and understandable, nothing complicated here. Okay, now we look down, and this graph tells us what's happening below the 50%. And as we can see, it's around 0.5, which is like 50%. There is a breaking point. Breaking point meaning that at this point, it starts the QW starts dealing the same damage as QE, and if we are going down below, it starts dealing QW starts dealing more damage, and this is why it is kind of light area, because up to around 30%, which is here, right? We can see that the region is not one-sided. Okay, that's what I mean by changing the color. This region represents two Q abilities that can do the maximum damage. And basically, if you think about it, right, against QE favors high AP numbers, okay? Which is why we can see that at higher AP ratios, we can see the lowest amount of blue, okay? So if you look at this and you think about, okay, my opponent has like 35%, I have 300 AP, just use QW because it's a low AP value. Uh, around around 50, you might 200 would be still enough for QE to deal more damage because uh, it's still very early in the region. Okay, and once we cross this 30% region, we get into the QW zone. Okay, so what happens here? Why is this line not moving here, but this line starts moving here? Okay, so it's very simple. Because QE is dominating on high P ratios, meaning that up like around 1000 HP in this around 1000 AP in this region, the QE will be dealing more damage, right? So this means that the highest damage is basically decided by QE, and the highest damage is basically requires the minimum percentage HP. So that's why this line is straight until the QQ starts overtaking the QE. And once we go over 3000%, QQ starts dealing the overall more damage than QE, meaning that it even at low HPs, it starts dealing more damage, meaning that the percentage starts to drop. And this is why we see the drop here. It's also because the Q starts dealing more damage at lower percentages, meaning that the percentage at which QW will start dealing more damage will drop. And if you look at this region, we could think about like, okay, if we have very low AP values, we would say that it is the QQ region. Okay, if we have something around the middle, uh, oh sorry, if we think about low values, it is the QW. If we think about something in the middle, it would be QQ, and high values would be QE. All right, right. Now we move to this light red area, and it is more interesting. Why? Because at 20%, it's not exactly. It is 4.286, but it's not really appropriate to write that this is the point where it's upscaling to the right, because it's more of the downside, but because to the right it's going down, I decided to put it anyways. What happens there? AP scalings at this point are the same. So the curve angle is the same for both of them, and at some point, at some HP, they meet, they overlap on top of each other. Okay, and this HP value happens to be 4286 HP. And then once we start looking below this point, or to the right to this point in this region, QQ no longer values the high AP ratios in that region, but low AP values. Okay, so if we look something around the like 5.25 thousand HP, right? At around well, it's like 8% or something like that. We can say if the value is around over 800, then QQ will still deal more damage. QW will start dealing more damage. But if it's 500, 400 AP value, then you should choose using QQ. Okay, and that's basically how we analyze the QE minimum damage chart, and that is what it tells us if we assume that QE only ticks gives us 10 ticks. And now moving to the QE average. So this region analyzes the same way, right? This is the QE region. It reaches the point where QW starts dealing more damage at very low AP values. It increases over time, where even at high AP values, QW starts dealing more damage, and it reaches the point at 13% where QW overtakes at all values QW. Okay, and because QE has 10% higher scaling because there's another 2 ticks, we have the shift on the percentage HP scale from 2.5k to 3.2k, and it shifts from 3k to 5k. And this is what we can see in the graphs. If we see, this is around 3.2k, and this is around 5k, compared to what we saw 2.2, 2.5, and 3k. Okay, that's basically the difference. Also, QW and QE, you can see it starts at around 0.4, which is 40%, and goes down to 15%. It's hard to see from this angle. I've shown how it is easier to evaluate the 15%. You can find it in the 3D graph section if you haven't watched before it. But basically, it is around 15% of current HP. Okay. Again, this region you can evaluate like the same. If you have high AP values, around 1000, you will value QE more over QQ. If you have lower AP values, you will value QQ over QE. Right? The more interesting part is basically the intersection, because before this we had the QW underneath it, but right now what we have is basically in the connected part, which is like between 3.2k and 5k, we have the area which is still decided on high AP values by the QE, meaning that the lowest percentages will be decided by the highest damage values, which are provided by the QE because it has the best scaling. And that's what we can see. We can see that QQ doesn't reach these high points at high AP values that QE can reach until it reaches it basically reaches around 4.7k, and then it starts interacting in Hwei's region. And once again, we have the same connection point where QQ and QW is basically the same line. However, right now it happens to be another point there because of the QE. QE also happens to be there, so that's why you have a bigger triple intersection. And this again, you can either go to the Excel and put exact values to see exact numbers, or you can just assume that QE prefers high AP values, QQ prefers middle values, and QW prefers low AP values until this point. And after this point, we reverse the system, and QQ starts preferring lower AP values over QW. And that's basically all for today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching, and I hope it was informative.